I remember the first time I stumbled upon the hollow deep in the Appalachians. It was late summer, the kind of heat that makes the forest heavy and thick, and I had been wandering trails that didn't appear on any map. Locals in the nearest town had warned me not to go near the hollows, muttering about old gatherings, rituals, and things better left alone. They didn't offer many details, just that it was safer to turn back. Of course, curiosity got the better of me. I convinced myself it was just a story, part of the mountain's way of keeping strangers away. I had always been drawn to places like this, the remote, forgotten pockets of the woods where you can almost feel the past pressing down through the trees. That evening, the forest grew unnaturally still. No birds, no insects, nothing. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. I felt the change before I saw it, a tension in the air that pressed against my chest. Then I noticed flickering lanterns in the distance, like fireflies, but too organized, too deliberate. I crouched behind a fallen tree, careful not to make a sound. Through the gap in the branches, I could see figures moving in silent, ritualistic patterns. They were wearing hoods and long, dark robes, their movements precise and synchronized. I could see the faint outline of an altar carved from twisted roots, knotted and gnarled like something alive. The smell hit me then, a faint metallic tang, like iron mixed with the earthy rot of the forest floor. I wanted to leave, but my legs refused to obey. Something deeper than fear held me in place, a mix of fascination and primal dread. One figure approached the altar, carrying something wrapped tightly in cloth. I couldn't see what it was, but the way the figure moved, almost reverent, made my stomach churn. Their chanting began, low at first, then growing in rhythm and intensity. The words were foreign, guttural, almost animalistic in their cadence. Each syllable seemed to twist in the air, pressing against my ears and making my skin crawl. I remember thinking as I hid in the shadows that I might have stumbled onto something older than the mountains themselves. The figures circled the altar, chanting in that strange hypnotic language, and the forest seemed to lean in, watching. The firelight from the lanterns cast shadows that moved independently of the figures, twisting across the trees in unnatural ways. I could hear my own heartbeat, pounding so loud I was sure they could hear it. My mind raced through every possible explanation, every rational thought I had left, but nothing fit. There was no sound of footsteps approaching, no rustle of leaves. Yet I felt eyes on me, an awareness that made my skin prickle as if the forest itself was alive and aware of my presence. Time stretched. I wasn't sure if it had been minutes or hours. The chanting never stopped, and the air grew heavier, almost suffocating. The figure at the altar began to unwrap whatever was inside the cloth. My stomach turned, but I couldn't look away. The object was small, shapeless, and it seemed to writhe slightly, though I knew it was impossible. I couldn't tell if it was alive or just a trick of the light and my imagination. The figures continued their ritual, stepping in unison, whispering words that made my throat tighten. Then, as suddenly as it began, the ritual ended. The figures froze for a moment, and then they dispersed into the forest, shadows swallowing them as they melted back into the darkness. The lanterns winked out one by one, leaving the hollow in complete darkness. I waited, holding my breath, until I was certain they were gone. Only then did I dare to move. I ran blindly, branches tearing at my clothes and scratching my arms, the uneven ground threatening to trip me with every step. I didn't stop until I reached the dirt road leading back to civilization, my lungs burning and my chest heaving. But even as I caught my breath, I could feel it, something following me. Not physically, but in the edges of my vision, in the corners of my mind. Whispers, faint but distinct, threaded through my thoughts, murmuring in the same guttural language I had heard at the altar. I tried to shake it off as adrenaline, imagination, the nervous fraying of a scared mind. But the whispers persisted, echoing in my dreams, slipping into my waking hours, appearing when I least expected them. In the rustle of leaves, in the sigh of the wind, in the shadows of my bedroom at night. I tried to tell someone, anyone, about what I saw, but the words fell flat. People looked at me with polite disbelief, murmuring that I must have imagined it. I started avoiding the woods altogether, even places I had frequented for years. Yet the hollow stayed with me. Memories of the gnarled altar, the chanting, the way the lanterns flickered against the twisted roots, haunted me. I started noticing patterns in the small things around me. The way a shadow lingered too long, the occasional inexplicable chill in the air, the distant echo of voices that seemed almost human but not quite. I began keeping a journal, writing down every whisper, every fleeting image, every shiver that crawled along my spine at the thought of those robed figures. The more I wrote, the more real it felt, as if documenting it somehow tethered the memory, gave it shape. But the memory is living, stubborn, a presence I can't shake, a reminder that some parts of the Appalachians are not meant for human eyes. I can still feel the hollow in my bones when the wind shifts just right. I see it in the reflections of water at dusk, in the spaces between trees when sunlight slants at the perfect angle. I know now that curiosity is a dangerous thing, that some stories are true and some places exist precisely to test the limits of human trespass. I've learned to avoid the hollows, to respect the warnings, yet I feel a pull that I cannot explain. Sometimes I think I could return just to see if the ritual repeats, just to see if the figures are still there, but I never will. The fear isn't only in the memory, it's in the anticipation of what might be waiting should I step back into that hollow. And so, I live with it, a quiet dread that follows me everywhere, a constant reminder that the mountains hold secrets older than we can imagine, and some whispers are meant to be heard only once. I had been hiking alone in the Appalachians, seeking the quiet I'd always found so comforting in the deep woods, the kind of silence that presses down on you and makes the world shrink to just the trees and your own breath. That night, the moon was hidden behind thick clouds, leaving the forest nearly black, the trail barely visible beneath my boots. I wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary, just the familiar crunch of leaves underfoot, the occasional rustle of a squirrel or bird. But then I noticed it, a flickering glow in the distance, small and steady, like a heartbeat in the dark. I thought at first it might be a camper, someone else trying to escape the solitude as I had. I had no reason to suspect anything else. As I drew closer, the shapes around the fire began to take form. There were figures, at least half a dozen, moving in a slow, deliberate rhythm, circling the fire in unison. At first, I thought it was just coincidence, the sway of people sitting around a campfire. But the more I watched, the more precise their movements became, almost too perfect, like a silent dance only they understood. Their hoods hid their faces, leaving nothing but shadow where eyes should be, and when they chanted, the sound wasn't quite human. It was guttural, rolling and low, blending unervingly with the crackle of flames and the whisper of the wind through the trees. I froze behind a ridge, trying to make myself small, hoping they wouldn't notice me, though every instinct screamed that they already had. Then one of them did. Their head tilted slightly as if listening, and for a moment, I felt the weight of a gaze that pierced the darkness. Panic surged through me, sudden and raw, and I stumbled backward over roots and loose rocks. The person at the fire raised an arm, and the others paused, their chanting halting like a record scratched mid-song. My heart pounded so hard I was sure it would give me away. I didn't stay to find out. I turned and ran, branches whipping across my face, tearing at my shirt and jacket, the uneven trail threatening to throw me to the ground at every step. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but the fear kept me moving faster than I thought I could. Behind me, I imagined I could hear them calling, faint voices that might have been the wind, or something else entirely. By the time I reached the old logging road that would take me back toward town, the sounds had faded, though the memory of that chanting clung to my mind like smoke. I thought I was safe then, but the forest has a way of following you, even when you leave it behind. In the days that followed, I could hear the rhythm in my sleep, faint and persistent, rising and falling like the heartbeat of that fire. Every time the wind shifted just right through the trees near my home, I swore I heard the low chant again, whispering just beyond comprehension. I would shake my head, telling myself it was nerves, the memory twisting with the hours, but the unease never truly left me. I can still picture the firelight, the way it flickered across the hoods and robes, making the shadows dance unnaturally. There was an intensity in their movements that made me question everything I thought I knew about the world I'd been walking through. Even when I told myself it had been a strange coincidence, or some eccentric local tradition, the way they moved in perfect unison, the way the chant rose and fell with deliberate precision, made rational explanations feel hollow. There was a presence there, a sense of something older and more deliberate than a group of people on a hiking trip, and it has stayed with me ever since. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, thinking I hear the soft crackle of a fire in the distance, a rhythm of chanting barely audible over the wind. I know the forest is far away, but the memory has a weight that bends the distance. I've considered returning, trying to rationalize what I saw, to understand whether it was just a strange gathering or something darker, something meant to remain hidden. But I've never gone back. The fear isn't only in the memory. It's in the anticipation, in the sense that even now, there are places in these mountains where the ordinary rules don't apply, where humans stumble into things they aren't meant to see. And so, I carry it with me. Every time I step into the woods, I feel it. The quiet rhythm, the unnatural stillness, the echo of voices that might not belong to this world. I think about those who warned me, muttering about gatherings and old ways, and I finally understand. The stories aren't just stories. Some places in the Appalachians hold a weight, a memory of something ancient and secret, and the firelight I saw that night wasn't just a campfire. It was a signal, a heartbeat of the forest itself, reminding me that some corners of the world are not meant for human understanding. Even now, long after that night, the chanting follows me. Not all the way, not in a form I can fully recognize, but in fragments. The wind through trees, the flicker of shadows, the way the air sometimes holds a strange, almost metallic tang. I know I will never forget it, and I know, deep down, that it will haunt me for the rest of my life. My friend had dared me, joking at first, to explore the abandoned cabin at the ridge of Cattail Creek. I didn't want to go, at least not at first. I'd heard the old stories about the place, how it had been left to rot decades ago, and how no one who went near it ever spoke about what they'd seen. But curiosity has a way of gnawing at you, and with a mixture of pride and foolishness, I found myself trudging up the steep, overgrown trail as the sun dipped behind the mountains, leaving shadows that seemed unnaturally long. The cabin appeared suddenly through the trees, its wooden boards warped and blackened, the roof sagging like it was giving way under some invisible weight. A chill crawled over my skin as I stepped closer. Inside, the cabin smelled of decay and damp earth, the scent of rot thick and heavy in the corners. Dust coated every surface, and the floorboards groaned under my weight. That's when I saw them. Masks, grotesque and twisted, arranged on pegs along the walls like trophies. Some were human-like but distorted, with hollow eyes and wide, mocking mouths. Others were almost animalistic, carved with features I couldn't name but felt deeply wrong. My stomach clenched, and I could feel a shiver crawl down my spine. I wanted to step back, leave immediately, but something compelled me forward, drawing me toward the masks despite the growing sense of dread pressing against my chest. Then I heard it. Footsteps echoing from somewhere behind me, uneven and deliberate. I spun around, but the cabin was empty. No one there. My heart thumped in my ears as I tried to convince myself it was just the floor settling, the wind moving through the broken windows. But the sound persisted, faint at first, then growing, a distant chanting, barely audible but insistent, threading through the walls and floor like it was coming from beneath the cabin itself. Shadows began to move across the windows, long and slow, stretching unnaturally as the last light of the day vanished. I could no longer tell if the chanting was outside, or inside, or simply in my head. It hit me then that the masks weren't decorations, or art, or anything innocent. They were warnings, records of something that had happened here, something that still lingered, watching. I stumbled backward, my eyes fixed on the hollow eyes of the masks, as if they were burning into me, marking me as someone who had seen too much. The chanting grew louder, a rhythm in the darkness that seemed to sync with my pulse. The shadows at the windows shifted in ways that made no sense, angles that shouldn't exist, movements that defied logic. I realized with a sudden, sinking clarity that I wasn't alone. Something in the mountains, patient and hidden, was aware of me. Panic surged through me, and I barely noticed myself crashing toward the door, my hands shaking as I tried to push it open. The hinges groaned, reluctant to let me escape, as if the cabin itself was trying to keep me inside. Branches scraped against the walls outside, but I didn't care. I flung the door open and ran, tripping over roots and rocks, branches slapping my arms and face as the night closed around me. Behind me, I thought I heard a faint echo of the chanting, a rhythm that seemed impossibly close, as if the cabin itself were breathing it into the darkness after me. I didn't stop until I reached the base of the ridge, until the cabin was nothing but a dark silhouette against the black mountains. But even then, the memory clung to me. The hollow eyes of those masks, the way the shadows moved with intent, the low chant threading through the walls, they've haunted me ever since. I began seeing things in the corners of my vision. Glimpses of shapes that vanish when I look directly, shadows that don't match any object, the sensation of being watched from places I cannot see. Every creak in the floorboards of my own home, every rustle of leaves on the trail near town, feels like a continuation of that night. Sometimes I dream of the cabin, waking in the middle of the night with a cold sweat, imagining the mask's twisted grins leaning over me. I feel compelled to return to see if the chanting resumes, to find out if whatever lingers there is still waiting. But I can't. The thought is terrifying yet irresistible. I've started avoiding the mountains altogether, though it isn't always possible. The memory follows me, the oppressive darkness of the ridge, the smell of damp rot mixed with a metallic tang of fear, the certainty that something unseen is always waiting, ready to welcome me back. Even now, I can feel it in the quiet hours, when the world feels small and the shadows long. There's a weight in the air, a low vibration in the silence, a hint of chanting that rises and falls in my ears. I tell myself it's the mountains, the wind, my imagination. But deep down, I know it isn't. The masks remain in my memory, their hollow eyes unblinking, a warning I can never ignore. The cabin is still there, somewhere at the ridge of Cattail Creek, and I can't shake the certainty that it watches for me, that it remembers. Some part of the mountains is patient, and it waits. It waits for those who dare to see, to cross the threshold, and maybe one day to return. And I know that if I ever do, there will be no way back. We were told never to approach the giant oak at the center of the valley. The locals spoke in low tones about it, as if even saying its name too loudly would invite trouble. People had vanished there, they said. During gatherings, no one dared explain fully. I'd always been careful in the mountains, respecting the old warnings, but that night curiosity got the better of me. The air was unusually still, the kind of heavy quiet that presses against your chest and makes the hairs on your arms stand on end. I crept through the underbrush, branches clawing at my jacket, and there it was, the oak. It was immense, impossibly so, its trunk gnarled and twisted, roots sprawling across the forest floor like the fingers of some long-dead giant. As I stepped closer, I noticed carvings in the bark, deep and jagged, symbols that made no sense to me, but that carried a weight I could feel in my bones. They weren't just scratches, they felt deliberate, intentional, alive somehow, like the tree itself had absorbed centuries of something dark and strange. The forest around me seemed to hold its breath, every sound muffled except for my own heartbeat hammering in my ears. Then, figures began to emerge from the shadows. They were draped in dark, flowing garments, faces hidden beneath hoods. They moved in a slow, purposeful rhythm, circling the oak as though it were the center of the world. I froze, unable to look away, every instinct screaming to run but my body refusing to obey. The chanting began then, low and guttural, rising and falling in a cadence that pressed into the very air. Each word hung heavy, oppressive, as if the forest itself listened, waiting. After each chant, there was a silence that felt unnatural, a pause so complete it made my skin crawl, as though the world had exhaled and I was the only thing left holding its breath. I could see their hands raised toward the tree, their bodies swaying in a rhythm older than anything I had ever known. I wanted to step back to flee, but the sight of the hollow in the trunk drew me closer. Something was being placed inside it. I couldn't make out what, but the movement was careful, almost reverent, and the weight of the moment pressed down on me in a way I had never felt before. I remember the smell of the valley, earthy and damp, tinged with something metallic I couldn't identify. The light of the lanterns the figures carried flickered across the carvings, making them seem to writhe in the shadows. My throat went dry, my legs felt like lead, and I realized I could hear my own breathing over the quiet that followed each chant. My mind couldn't reconcile what I was seeing. The ritual, the oak, the hollow filled with something I didn't want to know. It was all so deliberate that it felt as if I had walked into a memory older than myself, something the forest had been holding for centuries. When the ritual ended, the figures disappeared into the darkness as silently as they had arrived, leaving only the giant oak standing in the moonlight. The hollow seemed to pulse faintly, though I knew it couldn't. I stumbled backward, branches tearing at my clothes, tripping over the roots that sprawled like veins across the forest floor. My chest heaved, lungs burning, but I forced myself to keep moving, away from the valley, away from the oak that seemed to watch me even as I fled. By the time I reached the edge of the woods, the chanting and the presence of the figures were gone, but the memory of what I had seen clung to me, embedding itself in my mind like a brand. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the hollow oak from my thoughts. Shadows in my own home seemed to stretch and twist in ways that reminded me of that night. The wind through the trees carried echoes of the chanting, faint but unmistakable. Sometimes I would catch a flash of something in the corner of my eye while walking the trails, the shape of a hooded figure disappearing behind a tree, always gone when I looked directly. I began to understand why the locals whispered about the valley, why they avoided it, why they never spoke plainly of what happened there. Some things in the mountains are not meant to be understood, only respected and left alone. I've never returned to the valley. I don't plan to. But the image of that hollowed oak, the carvings, the figures, the way the forest itself seemed to breathe with the ritual, haunts me. It's in the quiet moments, the ones that press against you in the deep woods or in the stillness of night. The weight of it lingers, a constant reminder that some parts of the Appalachians hold secrets that are patient and deliberate, watching for anyone foolish enough to stumble upon them. And I know, deep down, that the valley remembers me. The hollowed oak waits, and if I ever return, I will not be alone. I had set out early that morning, drawn to a trail that didn't appear on any of my maps, a narrow ribbon of dirt and roots that wound through the dense Appalachian forest. The air was thick with the smell of wet leaves and earth, the sun filtering through the canopy in pale, trembling beams. At first, it seemed like any other hike, the calls of birds overhead, the distant rustle of squirrels, the familiar crunch of twigs under my boots. But soon, I began noticing things that didn't make sense. Footprints deep and wide, circled in patterns that no human or animal I'd ever seen could make. Charred remains of fires, blackened stones ringed in strange, haphazard ways, dotted the trail at irregular intervals. The metallic tang in the air grew stronger the deeper I went, subtle at first, then unmistakable, like iron warmed in the sun. My skin prickled with unease, and I slowed my pace, telling myself that someone had simply used this trail long before me, that it was an old hunter's path abandoned to time. As night fell, the forest changed entirely. The canopy swallowed the remaining light, leaving the trail bathed in shadows. That's when I first heard it, the chanting. Faint at first, like a murmur carried on the wind, then growing steadily louder, deliberate, and rhythmic. The rustling of dry leaves accompanied it, but the sounds weren't random. They seemed directed, as if the forest itself had been arranged to carry this ritual from some unseen clearing ahead. Shadows moved between the trees, precise and deliberate, stretching across trunks and ground in ways no ordinary animal could manage. I tried to convince myself it was my imagination, that the interplay of moonlight and branches was creating shapes my mind wanted to interpret as figures. But the chanting persisted, and the metallic tang in the air grew oppressive, almost choking. Panic settled into my chest as I realized I was trapped in the wake of something. Some ritual that had been performed recently, or perhaps was still ongoing. I turned to retrace my steps, but the trail seemed different now. Roots and rocks I had passed easily hours before twisted in unfamiliar ways. Fallen branches blocked what should have been open paths. Every turn led me deeper. Every familiar landmark vanished as if the forest itself had shifted to keep me within its grasp. I felt eyes on me, unseen yet insistently present, tracking my every move. My pulse pounded in my ears, and I found myself stumbling over loose roots, my hands scraping against rough bark, my breaths sharp and shallow. The chanting grew louder, rising and falling in waves, almost beckoning, almost threatening. I glimpsed figures moving at the edge of my vision, cloaked in shadow, their faces indistinguishable but their intent undeniable. I tried to scream, but the words stuck in my throat, swallowed by the heavy night. My footsteps faltered as I realized the sounds weren't coming from a single point. They were all around me, emanating from the trees, the ground, even the wind. The trail had ceased to be a path and had become a corridor, a channel for something that didn't want me to leave. The iron smell filled my nostrils now, stronger, tangy, biting. It made my mouth dry and my stomach twist. Hours passed, or maybe only minutes, I could no longer tell. The darkness seemed absolute, pressing against my senses, and still the chanting followed, sometimes faint, sometimes roaring, echoing off the hills I thought I'd seen. I stumbled into a small clearing, where I saw remnants of another fire, blackened stones forming a crude circle. I wanted to look away, to run blindly, but something drew me closer. Patterns of ash in the soil, symbols that I couldn't understand but that made my stomach tighten with recognition of something ancient, deliberate, human yet not entirely human. It was as though the clearing itself remembered what had happened here, and that memory was alive, watching me. By the time the first light of dawn crept through the trees, I had somehow stumbled out of the woods, back onto a path I recognized, leading toward the edges of civilization. I collapsed against a rock, shivering, exhausted, and the forest behind me seemed to sigh, the trees swaying with an almost sentient acknowledgement of my escape. But the feeling of being observed didn't leave me. Even now, weeks later, I sense those eyes in every shadow, every darkened alley, every fold of night that touches my home. My dreams are filled with glimpses of that trail, the strange circles of ash, the rhythmic chanting, the unseen watchers that folded the forest around me like a trap. I know I can never return to that path. The memory has altered me, left a weight in my chest that grows heavier when I hear the wind through the trees or smell iron in the air. I can trace the rhythm of that chanting in my pulse sometimes, involuntary, haunting. The forest has left its mark, a memory I cannot shake, and I understand now why locals never speak of the trail, why they avoid that valley, why the stories are whispered in hushed tones. Some places in the Appalachians are patient. They remember every step, every intrusion, every soul that dares to pass through. I left the forgotten path behind me, but the echoes remain, pressing into my mind, a reminder that some parts of the mountains are not meant to be crossed, or if they are never left unchanged. The night the blood moon rose over the mountains, the world seemed to shift. Its light was unnatural, crimson and impossibly bright, spilling across the ridges and valleys in a way that made the forest feel exposed, like a living thing with no place left to hide. I had heard the stories, whispered in the local diners and bars, of strange gatherings that happened only when the moon was full, of figures moving in patterns that no one dared describe. I had dismissed them as superstition, the kind of old mountain tales meant to keep kids and strangers out of the woods. But the smoke curling above the treetops drew me in, a thin, twisting ribbon that caught the red light and refused to vanish. Something was happening up there, and I could not turn away. I crept through the undergrowth, careful to keep my movements quiet, every snap of a twig underfoot making my pulse spike. The trees cast long shadows, distorted by the red glow, stretching across the forest floor in impossible angles. I could hear the distant crackle of fire and, beneath it, a rhythm, a low murmur, almost chanting. My curiosity battled with the dread climbing my spine, and I felt the forest closing in around me. The air was thick, pungent with the scent of burned wood and something iron-like I couldn't name. I tried to convince myself it was a hunting fire or a camp gathering, but the precision of the movement ahead told me otherwise. Peeking through a clump of saplings, I saw them, a circle of people moving in near-perfect unison, shadows flickering across the ground in the crimson light. Their arms rose and fell in synchronization, bodies bending and swaying with an almost mechanical devotion. There was something unholy in the way they moved, a sense of ritual that pressed on the edges of my understanding. Even from a distance, I could feel the intensity of their focus, the weight of whatever they were invoking, and my stomach tightened with fear. I wanted to turn back to run, but I could not tear my eyes away. One figure's head lifted as though sensing me, and I froze, my body pressed low against the undergrowth. The others continued, their movements fluid and unwavering, but the figure at the edge of the circle paused, and for a moment I felt exposed. I could not see a face, but the gaze felt like a physical pressure, a certainty that I had trespassed where I was not meant. My hands were clammy, gripping the ferns and broken branches at my sides, every instinct screaming to retreat. Yet I remained, caught between terror and fascination, watching as they lowered themselves toward the fire in the center. Hands raised, bodies trembling with what I can only describe as devotion. The chanting grew louder, a rolling guttural rhythm that filled the forest, weaving through the trees and bouncing off the rocky outcrops. each syllable pressed into my chest, heavy and unyielding. I wanted to cover my ears to shut it out, but I could not. There was a hypnotic quality to it, a cadence that made the hair on my arms stand straight and my teeth ache with tension. Every movement, every intonation of their voices, seemed deliberate, as though the forest itself had bent to accommodate the ritual. The smoke rose in coils, catching the crimson light, and the fire in the center seemed to pulse in time with the chant, an unnatural heartbeat I could not reconcile with anything I knew. Suddenly, the circle broke, figures shifting in ways that made my stomach clench. They knelt in perfect alignment, hands pressed together, heads bowed. My own head felt heavy, my lungs tight, and I realized that I had been holding my breath for what must have been minutes. And then, just as quickly, the fire flickered and the smoke vanished into the night, leaving only the moon's red glare to illuminate the clearing. My pulse was deafening in my ears as I stumbled backward, brushing against branches, tearing my jacket, desperate to put distance between myself and whatever I had witnessed. I did not look back, though the sense of being watched pressed down on me, a weight that refused to lift. I ran through the forest blindly, tripping over roots, slipping on moss-covered stones, the undergrowth clawing at my clothes and skin. The chanting, though distant, seemed to follow, carried in the wind like a memory I could not escape. Every shadow between the trees made me glance over my shoulder, but there was nothing. Nothing I could see, nothing I could name. Only the lingering awareness of the circle, the fire, and the figures who had paused and looked as though they knew I had intruded. I felt as though the forest itself was breathing around me, alive with an understanding that I was now part of its story, however unwillingly. By the time I stumbled onto a familiar logging road, the moon had begun to sink behind the western ridges, and the forest returned to ordinary darkness. I collapsed against a tree, gasping, every muscle trembling, but even in the safety of the open path, the weight of what I had seen clung to me. I could feel the rhythm of their chanting in my chest, as if it had imprinted itself on my body. The scent of smoke and iron lingered in the air, impossible to shake, and every shadow along the trail seemed to twitch unnaturally, a reminder that the forest had marked me, remembered me. Even now, weeks later, I cannot fully rid myself of the memory. I see it in the blood-red hue of certain sunsets, in the way shadows bend oddly across the forest floor, in the subtle, unsettling quiet that falls over the mountains when the wind dies. I have not returned to that clearing, and I never will. But I feel it in my dreams, the precise movements, the devotion, the fire that pulsed like a heartbeat under the blood moon. There is a weight in the air around me, a vigilance, a reminder that I crossed a threshold meant to remain untouched. That night under the blood moon changed something in me. It is a memory I cannot erase, a fear that does not fade. The mountains keep their secrets well, and some nights I can almost hear that distant rhythm, echoing faintly through the hills, calling, waiting, unbroken, unrelenting. I had always been drawn to the stories of Devil's Creek, the way the locals whispered about it in hushed tones, warning travelers to stay away after dusk. They spoke of strange lights, of people vanishing, of rituals no one could explain. I dismissed most of it as folklore, the kind of tales that grow tall with each retelling, but the curiosity never left me. One evening, the sky heavy with clouds and the air damp from an early mist, I found myself walking along the familiar trail toward the creek, camera in hand, thinking I might capture the beauty of the water at twilight. The trees leaned close over the path, and the shadows of their branches stretched like long fingers across the ground, whispering with the wind in ways I hadn't noticed before. The creek appeared suddenly, winding through the valley like a vein of black glass. Its surface shimmered oddly, reflecting the last of the pale light in oily rainbow-tinged ripples that made my skin prickle. Something about it was off, though I couldn't place why. As I stepped closer, the faint, rhythmic sound of chanting carried on the wind, distant at first but growing steadily, threading through the trees and the mist. I froze, every instinct warning me to turn back, but my feet kept moving, drawn forward by a compulsion I didn't understand. Then I saw them. Figures, kneeling on the banks of the creek, moving in slow, deliberate synchronization. Their hands were raised toward the sky, faces hidden in shadow and hooded robes, bodies swaying with a devotion that felt unnatural, as if they were not simply performing a ritual, but becoming part of the creek itself. The air thickened, heavy and metallic, making it hard to breathe. I clutched my camera tighter, lifting it to my eye, hoping to capture something tangible, some evidence that could explain the sight. The moment I looked through the viewfinder, the figures vanished, swallowed as if by the mist itself. My stomach dropped, a cold surge of panic flooding my veins. I stumbled backward, my foot catching on a root, and the camera slipped from my hands, skidding across the slick ground. The chanting did not stop. It persisted, soft and insistent, echoing through the hollow and the trees, following me even as I turned to flee. I ran blindly along the creek, branches tearing at my clothes and skin, the cold mist curling around my face, making every sound sharper and more ominous. Every step felt like a misstep, every shadow a figure watching, waiting. The forest seemed to stretch and fold in on itself, the familiar path dissolving into something I no longer recognized. By the time I reached a small clearing, my lungs burning and my heart hammering, I dared to look back. The creek lay still and empty, the mist curling over it in lazy spirals, concealing whatever had been there moments before. Yet the feeling of eyes following me lingered, insistent, like the forest itself remembered my trespass. I retrieved my camera, my hand shaking, but the memory of what I had seen remained sharper than any photograph could capture. I felt marked, as though the act of witnessing had tied me to the creek and its rituals in ways I couldn't untangle. Even in the days that followed, the chanting haunted me. At night, in the quiet moments before sleep, I could hear it threading through the edges of my mind, faint and rhythmic, sometimes joined by the sound of rushing water or the creak of a distant tree. I would wake to the smell of wet earth and something faintly metallic, a scent that reminded me of the creek and the vanished figures. I couldn't explain it, and I began to avoid the trails near Devil's Creek entirely. Yet the memory persisted. I have returned to that valley only in my mind. Every creek I see, every hollow I pass through, I feel that presence lurking at the edge of perception, the knowledge that what I glimpsed was real, and that the forest remembers. I can still see the kneeling figures, their hands raised to the sky, and I know that the creek holds more than water, more than the reflection of the moon. It holds a weight, a memory, an intent that will not be broken. The fear is quiet now, but it is constant, a reminder that some parts of the Appalachians are alive with histories we cannot understand, and that witnessing them carries a cost we are never prepared to pay. The night I came across the clearing, the air was biting cold, each breath misting in front of me like smoke. I'd been hiking later than I should have, following a faint trail that twisted through the Appalachians, overgrown and slick with fallen leaves. The forest was quiet in a way that made every snap of a twig, every rustle of dead leaves underfoot, feel like an alarm. I wasn't expecting anything unusual, but something pulled me deeper, an instinct I couldn't name. That's when I stumbled into it, a small clearing, perfectly round, illuminated by the pale light of a waning moon. At the center lay a circle of stones, arranged with precision, their surfaces slick with dew and cold, each one seeming to pulse faintly in the night. From the moment I stepped near the circle, the forest seemed to hold its breath. The usual sounds of nocturnal life, the call of owls, the rustle of squirrels, the whisper of the wind through branches, vanished. Even the air felt heavier, charged with an unseen weight that pressed against my chest. And then I saw them. Shadows moving along the perimeter, silent and deliberate. At first, I thought my mind was playing tricks, imagining movement in the corners of my vision, but the shapes shifted with purpose. There were several of them, hooded figures, though the hoods did little to conceal their shapes, each movement precise, measured and synchronized. My pulse roared in my ears, drowning out everything else, but I couldn't look away. I realized that they never spoke, not a single word, yet their presence was overwhelming. It pressed in on me, suffocating in its intensity, as if the act of standing there watching made me part of the ritual simply by noticing it. My instinct screamed to run, but my feet were frozen, my body betraying me with a paralysis I hadn't felt since childhood nightmares. I could feel the cold seep into my bones, but it was nothing compared to the chill crawling along my spine from the certainty that I was being watched, measured, judged. The stones at the center seemed almost alive, reflecting the faint light in a way that made them appear to shift subtly, as if the circle itself had been waiting for me. Slowly, I tried to move, stepping backward as carefully as I could, not daring to turn fully, not daring to draw attention to myself. Every movement was agony, the silence around me amplifying the sound of my own heart thudding in my chest. The shadows shifted as I did, always at the edges of my vision, moving with me, though I could never be certain if it was them or my imagination. There was a rhythm to it, a slow, deliberate cadence that synchronized with my breath and pulse, a terrible and meticulous harmony that seemed older than the mountains themselves. Eventually, I forced myself to break into a slow, careful retreat, keeping my eyes fixed on the circle. It remained motionless in the moonlight when I dared to glance back, though the sense of being observed did not lift. I fled the clearing, scrambling through the underbrush, branches tearing at my clothing, scraping my skin, but it didn't matter. I could feel the weight of those silent watchers in every step I took, following me through the woods, lingering just beyond the trees, pressing on the edges of my awareness. The forest seemed to shift around me, the familiar paths distorted, roots and rocks where none had been before, as if the night itself were conspiring to keep me inside its boundaries. By the time I stumbled onto a logging road far from the clearing, the intensity of the presence began to ease, though it never entirely left me. My breaths came in ragged gasps, the cold sweat of fear soaking through my clothes, but the image of that circle stayed with me. I couldn't forget the precision of the stones, the deliberate movements of the shadows, the oppressive silence that seemed to wrap the forest like a living thing. Even in the days after, I felt it in my dreams, the echo of the circle in the quiet moments before waking, a rhythm of fear that the mind could not shake. I have avoided that part of the wood since, but I can still sense it. Any clearing, any pattern of stones, even the way shadows stretch across the forest floor, can trigger the memory. The silent circle is not just a memory. It is a presence, an imprint left on the land and on me, a reminder that some rituals are meant to extend their influence far beyond the night they occur. I feel it in the wind through the trees, in the way darkness pools in hollows and valleys, in the stillness that presses down when the world should feel alive. And I know, deep down, that the forest remembers me as I remember it, and that some part of that circle waits patiently for the next witness.